Why did I decide to choose the topic Joseph? Because for a long time I've been reading Joseph and thinking about, okay, what does Joseph have to offer? And for a very long time I've read it, but not paid too much attention to it. So this talk about tonight is going to hopefully change your mind on a few things as well as it changed mine. So all of us know the story about Joseph as a young man who was loved by his father and hated by his own brothers. They hated him so much that they plotted to kill him. Reuben, one of his brothers, convinced his other brothers not to kill him, but rather throw him into an empty cistern or pit where he then can die. Reuben's idea was to go back and save Joseph at a later stage, but Joseph got sold to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. The Ishmaelites then sold Joseph to the Egyptian, where he went to work in Potiphar's house. And then, long story short, Potiphar's wife fell in love with Joseph, tried to lay with him, but he refused. And at the pinnacle of Joseph's career, where a lot of people might see it, he gets charged with something he didn't do. And so he gets thrown into prison, and in prison he found favor with the warden. And the warden felt at rest because whatever Joseph did, it was a success. And 2 years later, after Joseph been in prison, he interpreted a few dreams. 2 years later, he interpreted Pharaoh's dream about the mules and the grain, and Joseph get made ruler over Egypt and saved his family. Does that story make sense, or does everyone know it like that? Now, for a very long time, I've read the story or read the study, but never paid too much attention to it. And after I decided, okay, let's do an actual study about Joseph, I figured out that Joseph is such a complex study that you actually have to split it into three. So tonight we're going to unpack the phase one, which is called the molding phase, where God uses Joseph as a mold to create his plan or to do his will. In phase two is where Joseph is seen as the provider, where he provides for his family. And then phase three is where Joseph is seen as this wise ruler or leader. So why do I say phase two, phase one? It's just a figure of speech. So when we start in Genesis 37, we're going to start with phase one. As a potter molds his clay before creating a pot or a jug, that's exactly what Jesus did. God did with Joseph as well. So let's turn to Genesis 37. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on Genesis 37 all the way to 41. Don't worry, we're not going to read all of that. But in the beginning of Genesis 37, verse 2, we read, at the age of 17, Joseph was pasturing the flocks of his father with his brothers. Now, for a long time, I thought about, okay, Joseph had 12, or Joseph was one of 12 brothers. It never occurred to me that Joseph only had one real brother and 10 half brothers. Now, later in the story, we'll see about who Joseph's other brother is. Spoiler alert, it was Benjamin. The other 10 brothers was seen as half brothers, the children of his father's wife. Now, that made me think a bit and decided, what else haven't I read in the story? Now, in Genesis 37, verse 3 to 4, we read, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, this isn't the first time where favoritism is mentioned in the Bible. Now, a lot of people know, okay, Joseph was seen as a good boy. His father loved him so much that he got a robe or a very colorful robe. Now, when else does favoritism get mentioned in the Bible? Well, if you take one generation up, Joseph's father, Jacob, was mentioned as a favorite, and then his grandfather as well. Isaac was also shown favoritism. So due to this favoritism and his self-confidence, Joseph was hated by his brothers and probably mocked as well. As we're going to unpack this story, we will see that Joseph did a lot of things that was not as his brothers would have wanted him. But in the beginning of the chapter as well, we see that Joseph went to his father and he already started telling them about all the bad things his brothers are doing. So in verses 5 to 8, we read, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamt. Behold, we are being sheaved in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, to me, this is probably where Joseph's problem started, or let's put it in a good light. This is where Joseph's road started to become one of the best leaders of his time. Now, on a daily basis, we get put in a situation as well where we might do something that we get mocked for or that people don't like us for. And it's up to you to determine how are you going to take that situation. So after Joseph told this to his brother, they hated him even more and mocked him and even tried to kill him or started thinking about killing him. And why did they do it? Because they were thinking that he is the youngest that will rule over them or reign over them. In verse 10 to 11, we read, Then he dreamt another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowed down to me. But when I told it to his fathers and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I, your mother, and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Now this made his brothers even more mad, and it started making them jealous. And then jealousy turned to anger, so no wonder they tried to kill him. Here's the youngest child, the most loved child, telling his entire family that one day you will bow before me. I don't know what your situation is at home, but imagine here one of your children come to you and say, Mom, Dad, family, in about 10 years from now, you will bow before me. What will you do? I think I will lose it a bit and tell my child, listen, grow up. This is not the time for this now. But one thing Jacob did is he started thinking, what does Joseph's dream mean? Where his brothers got jealous, Joseph's father started, what can this mean? So let's go to verse 13 where it says, And Israel said to Joseph, Are your brothers not pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. Now, to me here personally, this is probably the last time that Jacob will see Joseph. Jacob sends off his son onto a mission to go find out how his brothers are doing and see how he can find out, is everything okay? How's the cattle or the flock going? With the idea that his son will return back to him. Now, Joseph went off on this mission, and in verse 15, we read that Joseph was wandering. And a man found him wandering in the field, and the man asked him, What are you seeking? Now, as I was doing this, I found about 28 similarities between Jesus and Joseph. Unfortunately, that we will only unpack in the third session, so stay tuned. Now, Joseph started wandering in the fields to find out where his brothers are. Now, if Joseph really wanted to go see his father or his brothers, he would have go to the first person and say, sorry, do you know where my brothers are? But a man came to him and said, what are you seeking? And then Joseph said, I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are, pasturing the flock. And a man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. So in verse 18 we read now, they saw him from afar, and behold, before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. So this is the first sign we see where Joseph would have been wearing his colorful cloak or garment or whatever you want to call it, because his brothers saw him from afar and they started to conspire against him. Up to now, Joseph is just feeling free and traveling, but what is waiting for him, no one can prepare him for. Now imagine you excited to see your family just to find out, hey, they want to kill you. In verse 20 we read, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see that what will become of his dreams. Now, here one of his brothers, half-brothers, steps up to the plate and say, no, why do we want to kill him? Why do we want his blood on our hands? Let's just throw him into the empty cistern or pit and let him die there from himself. Even though Reuben was thinking, if I can just get them to do that, I can come back later and save him. Now, take that for a minute and remember that sentence where Reuben says, throw him into a pit and I can save him. In verse 21 to 22 we read, but things turned out a little bit different. In verse 26 to 29, then Reuben said to his brother, what profit is it if we kill our brother and console his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brother listened to him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, here again, for a long time, I thought that Reuben was with his brothers. But as we read on, when Reuben came back a little bit later, his brother was gone. So here we get the indication that Reuben wasn't with his other brothers. And that leads me to the question, where was Reuben? Okay, so when Reuben came to the pit and he found his brother or the cistern empty, he probably would have been shocked or really worried about what happened to my brother. So now he's got two options. He can either go and confront his brothers and find out, what did you do with my brother? Or he can go and tell them, listen, the pit is empty, and see what their reactions are. So Reuben went and asked their brothers what happened. But let's go back to the 20 shekels of silver for a minute there and think about it. So Joseph had one blood brother and 2 or 10 half brothers. So if Reuben was not there, that means, let's say all of his brothers went out to look after the animals. That means 9 of his brothers were still left. And that means, in turn, if you take 20 divided by 9, it's just over 2 shekels per person. And you'll see as we go on, the number 2 appears a lot in this study. Joseph had 2 dreams. They were sold for 2 shekels, or each brother got 2 shekels, 20 shekels. But let's not dwell on that, and first look what Reuben did in verse 29 to 32. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not. In the NLT, it actually says, and they sent a note with. So let's take the note for an example. I just want to read it for you out of the NLT. In Genesis 37, verse 29. Genesis 37, verses 29. Sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. When he went back to his brothers and lamented, "The boy is gone, what will I do?" Then the brothers killed a young goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They sent this beautiful robe to their father with this message, "Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?" And then it just goes on. It says Jacob recognized the robe. Now, that surely a matter of fair, or you losing a brother would have been a big enough situation for you to go home and console with your parents or mourn the death of your brother. And that started getting me thinking is, what about if these brothers started feeling guilty for what they've done? They had so much hate, so much jealousy towards their brother that they would do anything to get rid of him. But now that he's gone, what now? Did they really want to get rid of him? Are they missing him? So why didn't they not take the coat back to their father? Maybe they were ashamed. So the rest of the chapter of 37, we read about Jacob mourning the death of his son. So let's skip ahead to chapter 39, where we read about Joseph in Egypt. This is where Potiphar bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites, and with the Lord being with Joseph, Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes, and soon he was given complete administrative duties over all things. One thing we don't know is how long Joseph worked for Potiphar before his wife started getting feelings for Joseph or looking at it with lustful eyes. So let's go to verse 6 and 7. Now Joseph was a handsome in form and in appearance. So after some time, Potiphar's wife started getting feelings for Joseph and wanted to get Joseph to lie with her. So we'll use lie as a nice word. And Joseph just kept on saying, "No, I can't do this," out of respect for his master, but out of the biggest respect for God. In verse 8 to 9, we read, "But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?'" But as we read on, Potiphar's wife kept on going at Joseph. And in verse 11 to 12, "But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there, she caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house." Now, so first expressions, we can see that maybe Joseph's, let's call it luck, has ran out. Because surely if you committed this sin against your master's wife, there's a big chance of you either being put in jail or being killed. But let's go on. In verse 16 to verse 19, we read, "Then She laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out the house. As soon as his master heard these words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me. His anger was kindled." Now, firstly, you would think that his master trusted Joseph with so much. Surely he would have asked Joseph, "Okay, Joseph, what's your side of the story?" But no, he just listened to his wife. So Joseph gets thrown into jail. And at this point in time, it almost seems like the good guys always finished last. Why do I say that? Being in prison might have dampened Joseph's mood, as he worked hard and always ended up in a less desired position. But one thing Joseph always did, he kept God in his heart and on his mind. And soon Joseph found favor with the prison warden in verse 21 and 22. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all prisoners who were in prison, whether was done there. He was the one who did it. Now, with Joseph in charge, the warden had no worries, and he didn't have to think about any other things. Just as Potiphar was, Joseph worked hard, proved to himself, "I am worthy," but everything he did, he always kept God in mind. He always worked with God's plan. And we can see here, God is molding Joseph one bit at a time for something bigger. Joseph doesn't know yet what is bigger, what God's plan is, but he just knows that God has a plan for him. Now, let's start going to chapter 40, and here we'll see about being in the right place at the right time. In verse 40, verse 1 to 3, we read, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers and chief cupbearers and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the same house of the captain of the guard." Now, one thing we will look at now is that Joseph paid attention to every single detail that happened in prison. In the prison where Joseph was confined. But our story only starts in verse 6. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. Joseph paid attention to what was happening around him, and that's probably what made Joseph so good at what he did. He paid attention to God and the people he was with. So let's go to verse 7 where it says, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him in verse 8, "We have had a dream, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell me. Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer." In the same way, the baker came to Joseph in verse 16 to 19 hoping that Joseph will give him the same type of answer that he just gave the cupbearer before him. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There was 3 cake baskets on my head, and the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered him and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head up from you and hang it on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from it. Not so much good news as what the cupbearer got, but his dream was interpreted. Here again, we see the number 2 coming forth. 2 dreams, 2 separate people. Now, God used Joseph to exalt him at the exact right time he needed. Joseph only asked one thing in verse 14. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of his house. Just as Joseph mentioned, 3 days later, the cupbearer was restored to his rightful place and the baker was killed. But nothing happened regarding Joseph's request, and Joseph spent the next 2 years in prison until the day Pharaoh had his dream in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 41. So verses 1 to 7 of 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after then sprouted 7 ears, thin and brittled by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh woke, and behold, it was a dream. Now, here Pharaoh sends for all his magicians, all his enchanters, but no one can interpret Pharaoh's dream. I wonder why. Up to now, God has molded Joseph into what he needed. And in verse 9, the cupbearer remembers what Joseph asked him. So let's go to verse 14 to 32, where Pharaoh asked for Joseph to be brought to him. But one thing Joseph does is, before he goes and meet Pharaoh, he has a shave and takes a bath or a shower to clean himself because of the respect he wanted to show towards Pharaoh. So verse 14 to 32, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it was not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still ugly and thin, as at the beginning. Then I woke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing in one stalk, full of good, 7 ears withered, thin, and written by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh are one, but God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows and 7 good years, and the 7 great years are 7 years. The dreams is 1. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears written by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine. This will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that things is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. One thing that stood out to me is that Joseph made it very clear to Pharaoh that it was God giving him the ability to interpret his dream. But the thing that shocked me the most, or that stood out to me, is the humility of Joseph in verse 33 and 36. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish throughout the famine. Now here you would have think that here's this man, this young man, going to Pharaoh and say, this is what your dream means. Surely you could have asked for anything from Pharaoh. But what he did is he told Pharaoh, this is what you are supposed to do. Now remember me telling you about God molding Joseph into this time in his life, this molding him for the years of opportunity, this position, a position he dreamed of years ago, got mocked about and nearly killed for. So let's go back where Joseph told his family, these are my dreams, you will bow before me. And finally, Joseph can have the opportunity, but he tells Pharaoh, you must find someone to do these things. And verse 37 to 44, we read, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves at your command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it in Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in a second carriage, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Now imagine all that power, all that trust. He could have done anything he wanted. He could have said, kill this person, and he would have been killed, or raise this person and he would have been raised, or build something new and it would have been built. But in verse 44 and 45 we read, moreover Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Terah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Now, here we read about a 30-year-old leading the country of Pharaoh. Some people might have thought, what does this boy know, or what can he do? But what they didn't know is God was molding Joseph, teaching Joseph, raising him up into an excellent position, and then knocking him down over and over and over again for 13 years. 13 years of trials, 13 years of temptation, tests, and God just kept going at Joseph, molding him. In verse 46 to 57, we read, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second was called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my afflicted. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph has said, there was famine in all the land, but all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt were famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you do. So when the famine spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, before the famine was severe all over the earth. And just as Joseph has told Pharaoh what would happen. Now, in closing, I'm going to stop there. And in the second study, we're going to look at where Joseph's brothers actually do come to him, and all the lessons that Joseph was taught. He was put in such a position where he could have been to his brothers and said, no, you go. But he took the high road and said, let's help them. But one thing I want you to think about is, even though we get tested and molded on a daily basis, most of the times we don't know what's going on, what's going to happen, or where we're going to go from here. Just remember that God is molding you for something bigger. Just like God molded Joseph to be put in a situation where he can save his family, even though they wanted to kill him, God is also molding you in a situation that you don't know yet. Amen.